He is a conservation biologist and expedition leader with a passion for challenging fieldwork and science communication. He's going to talk to us this evening about valuing nature. Please join me in welcoming James to the stage.
Good evening, everybody. I'm the last thing standing between you and the bar, and unfortunately you might need it after this. Shane said to talk about the future of exploration, and I thought I'd start with something a little bit different. And if I may, I'd like to be a bit different and ask you all to close your eyes for a moment. That is the song of the Kauai o'o bird. Now, that's a male, and it's singing to a female that unfortunately isn't there. That's because that is the last male, and that recording was made in 1987, and it hasn't been seen since. It is, as far as we know, extinct. So no one else will ever get to hear that awesome song singing through the Hawaiian canopy. This is the Christmas Island pipistrelle. And as recently as 2006, there were lots of them living on Christmas Island, locally common, living in people's houses and settlements. And then it started to decline. And in 2009, in January 2009, scientists already began to flag with the Australian government that for some reason this species was disappearing. And they dithered, and they dilly-dallied. And finally, in August, they sent a team to Christmas Island with the permission to collect the last few surviving Christmas Island pipistrelles and bring them into captivity in the hope that they could save the species. And they were too late. The team set out sound sensors throughout the forest. That's the best way to try and find these bats. And they caught the sound of a single individual. They couldn't catch it. And they heard it for 3 nights in a row. And on the 26th of August, 2009, they caught this. That's it. And that was the last time it was heard. It's never, ever been heard since. And so as far as we know, the Christmas Island pipistrelle is also extinct. It's listed as critically endangered for now, but it's not been seen or heard since 2009. And then my favourite and least favourite at the same time, this is the Rab's fringe-limbed tree frog. Try saying that after a few beers. It's found in Panama on a single Pacific-facing mountain, and it was only discovered, I think, in 2005. By the time they managed to assess it in 2008, it was listed as critically endangered. A couple of cool things about this frog. It can fly. That's pretty cool for a frog. It sticks out those great big fanned legs and jumps from tree to tree, gliding like a flying squirrel. It's also the only species of frog in the world where the tadpoles derive nutrients by eating the cells off the dad's skin. So he reverses his bum into the little pool of tadpoles, and they nibble on his back. Yeah, bet you didn't think you were going to learn that tonight. And the fate that has beset so many of the world's amphibians, in 2009, chytrid fungus, which is a fungal disease being spread around the world by the pet trade, started approaching this mountain. And scientists leapt into action. They collected several of these, several other species, and they took them into captivity in zoos around the United States and around the world. Despite every best effort, every single captive breeding program for this species failed. They managed to get eggs, they managed to get tadpoles a few times, but they just couldn't raise them. And by 2012, there were just 2 left. And then on the 9th of December this year, less than 2 months ago, the last one, called Tuffy, died. His keeper came in on the morning of the 9th of September, less than 2 months ago, and he was dead. And it's rare for us to know almost down to the hour when a species became extinct. We think of the ones in the past, and we know some of the things that once lived. But to know down to the hour when a unique species that can fly went extinct is quite tragic. Now, we know, this is what he sounds like. A little bit like a dog, perhaps. We know that in the last 40 years, incidentally about as long as Explorer's been running exactly, we know that we've lost more than half of the world's wildlife. The populations of vertebrates on Earth have more than halved. Now we've lost more than 90% of the populations of our large fish species in the world's oceans. All but one of the world's ape species are threatened with extinction. The only one that isn't is sitting in this room. We've lost 3 of the world's 9 species of tiger. Now, tigers are the big ones. They're the flagship ones. They're the ones that we don't lose, like the panda and the polar bear. But 3 of the world's 9 species of tiger have slipped to extinction. This is the Caspian tiger, living around the Caspian Sea, last seen in 1992. This is the Javan tiger. Incidentally, I was sort of looking this up just before this talk. This photograph is the last photograph, and it's from 1976, the first year of Explore. We've also lost the golden toad. We discovered it in the 70s, and 25 years later, this was the last time it was seen, almost certainly wiped out by climate change. And we've lost even big iconic things like the Yangtze River dolphin in 2002. In the last 40, 50 years, not only have we lost these things, we've also developed the entire system by which we categorize how endangered life on Earth is, the IUCN Red List. And this is a wall in Cambridge at the new David Attenborough building with the name of every endangered species. And I can tell you that the wall is enormous. We've lost all of this, all of the species I showed you just there, since the first group of intrepid young explorers sat in this room and the very first Explore. This was the program. We've lost all of this since we had the ability to kind of even more sillily than what the previous speakers have talked about, Ollie, strap ourselves to the top of rockets and blast off into space. That's quite a big achievement, yet we can't seem to stop the loss of biodiversity on Earth. So am I going to go on for 15 minutes in this really depressing way? No. And that's because there is one thing I'd like you all to remember over this Explore weekend, and that is that the things the people in this room do make a real difference. This is the decline in the status of birds, mammals, and amphibians over the last 40 years. The line going down is bad. It means that slowly over time, things that are endangered are becoming critically endangered, things that are critically endangered are becoming extinct, and so on. And this is what has really happened. This is a meta-analysis of more than 20,000 species on Earth. But what would have happened if we'd all done nothing? What would have happened if Explore had never begun? What would have happened if Silent Spring had never been written, if the environmental movement had never started, if none of the amazing explorers in this room have ever done any of the expeditions? Well, that's what scientists exist to try and guess. And the red lines show you what would have happened. Now they're close. They're close to the black ones. But that difference between those lines, that is the difference that we're all making. That is the difference that conservation can make. If we didn't do any of these things, there are more species that would be extinct. There's more wildlife that would have disappeared. The world would have lost a little bit more of its wonder. And so everything you do does make a difference. And that's the most important thing. Maybe we need to do a bit more work on amphibians. If we look at the species that we actively work on, this is the work of Borrell, the conservation charity. If we look at the species, 19 species that they actively work on around the world, we see an enormous improvement. If they hadn't done that work, our best guess is a 23% decline. So it does show that conservation can and does work. We just need to do more of it. This is Madagascar. This is the place that's my soft spot. And much of it should look like this. This is some of that emerald-rich, incredible rainforest. Now, Madagascar's got biodiversity unlike almost anywhere on Earth. And I mean, you can tell a place has biodiversity if it gives you a bad back carrying the field guides, and if every single page looks exactly the same. That's a really good indication. There are 105 species of lemur on Madagascar, all of which are, of course, found nowhere else in the world. But that pales compared to the staggering variety of amphibians and reptiles. Our best guess are that there are 7, 8, maybe 900 species, half of which are undescribed. And in fact, that photo should much more look like that. And they're a fantastic thing to study. But unfortunately, most of Madagascar looks like this. Madagascar's got one of the highest rates of deforestation in the world. We don't really know what it once looked like, but we know that at least 2/3, 3/4 of the rainforest has been lost. One of the problems is when you lose rainforest, that heavy rain, that baking sun, you get massive, massive erosion. And this is some of the landslips that you see in the area. All of that soil, all of that lifeblood of the country washes away into the rivers. This is the Betsiboka River in full flood. And from space, Madagascar literally looks like it's bleeding. Now, erosion, that's not a sexy subject that you try and get people. It's not a big science communication subject. But once you lose that soil, you lose your opportunity to help reforest that land. Once the soil's gone, so is your opportunity. Last year, funded by the RGS, the Zoological Society of London, and the Scientific Exploration Society, we led a big team to an area in the north of Madagascar that's very conveniently covered by cloud. And our aim was to study this fragmented forest. Now, I've told you about deforestation. We all know that that's bad. As the forest disappears, so do the species. But one thing we don't think of is edge effects. As you can see, that the forest that's left in Madagascar isn't in one nice little chunk. Scientists would love that. Scientists would love to just have that nice, maybe square, make it square, nice piece of forest that we could put a very neat fence around and do all our experiments. But unfortunately, the rainforest that's left in Madagascar is in funny little pieces. It's in funny little odd shapes. And when you have that, all of a sudden they have a much greater perimeter. And I'm going to explain to you what I mean. If you've ever stood on the edge of even a forest in the UK, if you stand on the edge, you can feel the sun on your face, you can feel the warmth, maybe you can feel the breeze. Maybe you can see that there's no leaf litter, perhaps. As you move backwards, deeper and deeper into the forest, it gets cooler, it gets more humid, you get more leaf litter, less wind, less disturbance, less sunlight. So all in all, edges are very different to the interior of forest, and that's something we don't often think about. In Madagascar, the staggering statistic is that 80% of the surviving forest is within 1 kilometre of an edge, and we don't know what edges do. We know they're different, but if you're a small little frog, you're very, very susceptible to changes in humidity, changes in temperature. I'd hazard a guess that you probably don't like it on the edge. On the edge, the temperature can change like this between day and night, whereas in the middle, it's only doing this. And so we set out to try and understand exactly what effect those edges have on the reptiles and amphibians in Madagascar. This gives you an idea of quite how it can change. The smaller and the more unusual shapes your fragments can become, the larger the ratio of edges. And then when you get to these really, really small little patches, which are very characteristic of Madagascar, almost everything is edge. And we don't know the depth of the edge. If the first 100 meters of the forest is different, you could have a fragment 200 meters across, and it could perhaps be worthless for conservation. And that's what we set off to try and find out. Like all good expeditions, it wasn't very simple. We got in really big puddles and had to get really big zebu, which are the cows there, to try and pull us out. We employed 14 and 15-year-old boys to carry all our equipment. They were much tougher than us. And at long last, we reached the edge of the rainforest. Now in Madagascar, you can take almost any village, any settlement, and you can draw a perfect line with a compass around it. And that will be the area that's deforested. It gets deforested out in perfect circles like that, because you'll always walk to the nearest bit of forest you can. And so after a long few days, we reached the edge of this forest with our local guides. And the edge was beyond our wildest dreams. This edge has been there more than 30 years, perhaps 40 years, at least as long as satellite records go back. And it's absolutely perfect. The forest literally stops. It's like a wall of green. absolute scientist's dream. It's exactly what you want. And so we set up a research station right in the heart of the forest, studying these edges. We shared our Christmas Day dinner in the middle of a torrential downpour. We ran transects counting these reptiles and amphibians and mapping their location with relation to the edge. And we spent many, many hours walking along, staring at the ground. Now give me a little wave if you can see the little animal in that photo. Right, the people that are waving are the ones that get employed on the next trip. If anyone can't see it, I don't even know if I have a laser, but there he is. That's the kind of thing you're looking for. The reptiles and amphibians in Madagascar vary from the bruchisia where the chameleon can literally stand on the head of a match, up to panther chameleons 2 foot long. And we took all this data, we mapped it, we turned it into exactly the kind of information you need to make conservation suggestions, to make input into what you can do to conserve this landscape. Someone once told me that every graph you show in a talk, you'll halve the number of the audience of your next talk. But I'm going to take the risk. This is the edge, this is the interior, and this is what happens to bufid tree frogs. Exactly the opposite. They absolutely love the edge, and then they drop off. Why that is, I don't think anybody knows. This is the last thing we expected to find. It could be because there's more fruit, maybe there's more insects, maybe there's more sunlight. They like the sunlight on the edge. But the bufid frogs, much more common on the edge. The Kaluma chameleons, they like the edge less. They certainly won't be found dead outside the forest. And then they slowly increase, and then they seem to normalize. They don't seem to be too worried. And then the bruchisia, they certainly don't seem to like the very edge, but then they increase as they go in. We take all of this information for all these different groups of species, and we map all these graphs together. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk you through them all. And then, what did we find? Well, this is a good news story. After 30 or 40 meters, almost all the species that you would expect to find in this piece of forest appear. Lots of them can't live right on the edge in the first 10 or 20 meters. There isn't enough leaf litter for the bruchisia chameleons. There aren't some of the food sources for some of the other species. But after 30 or 40 meters, they're all there. Now, before we went, if you talk to the world's best scientists, the people that know the most about edge effects, the guesses on what this number would be is anywhere between 10 meters and 1,000 meters. And so for the answer to be 30 to 40-ish, I'm a scientist, I'll always say ish, that is really, really encouraging. And of course, at the same time, it's a privilege to discover a handful of species that are entirely new to science. The only reason we discovered them is because no one has looked here before. One last thing. I started off a little bit depressingly, and perhaps I should finish that way too, because there are so many challenges for conserving biodiversity on Earth. This is the Cebu Flowerpecker. I come up with all the weirdest names, don't I? This is the Cebu Flowerpecker. And in the early 20th century, it comes from the island of Cebu in the Philippines, it was unfortunately thought to be extinct. Almost all the forest on the island of Cebu had disappeared. There were aerial surveys, there were expert ornithologists. They scoured the island for decades. There were expeditions in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, looking for this bird, and no one found it. And at last, it was officially declared extinct in the 80s. And then in 1992, 0.03% of the forest on the island of Cebu is still left standing. Someone saw this. And it's still there, against all of the odds, against all of those expeditions that went looking for it, in an area of rainforest less than 15 hectares. High up on a cliff in a very, very remote area. It's thought the population is 60 to 70 birds. So it's not out the woods, but it's still there. And the thing I'd like you to remember is that this next century will be the most important century for the environment in the history of the planet and the future of the planet. The species that are on the Earth in 1 million years will be decided in the next 100. And there's never been a generation that has more opportunity and more power to influence the fate of the natural world than the one that's here now. So as you go in to explore this weekend, with all possible enthusiasm and energy, remember that you're the ones that can make a difference, and remember the Cebu Flowerpecker, and never to give up hope. Thank you very much.
Tom, Oliver, Emily and James, thank you, all four of you, for such a spectacular, inspirational quartet of talks, from mountain to ocean to rainforest, with this constant message of geographical urgency and that message, James's message, from the Cebu Flowerpecker, that we should never give up, and that the future of the planet resides in spaces like this with us today. We have